From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with Joe Sternberg and Kim Strassel. And Joe, just one other point I want to elaborate on the subsidy point that Kim made. When you get these massive subsidies, and this is going to be the biggest green energy subsidy bill in history, what happens is you incentivize businesses to say, okay, we're going to invest in this stuff because, hey, it's going to be free. I mean, we're going to get all kinds of subsidies to do it, and then we're going to get tax benefits as well. So you push investment into a particular area. And when it comes to solar and wind energy, a large part of it is to produce electricity, and that is a supply to the electric grid. And when you invest in solar and wind and you have the incentive to do that if you're a utility, what happens is you have less incentive, and in fact a negative incentive, to invest in baseload power like nuclear power, certainly coal, which is this bill is going to attempt to kill, and oil and gas as well. And of course we know that solar and wind power are not always reliable for the reasons that the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. And so what that means is you get a less reliable electric grid because you have less backup power. We've seen that in California. We've seen that in Texas. We saw the warnings about energy use in the upper Midwest this summer for the first time I can remember. So these are the effects that happen that are not easily identifiable, but they are going to happen when the government decides that it's going to favor certain kinds of investment over others.
Yeah, I mean, the great frustration of all of these projects over the years is that, economically speaking, the answer is incredibly simple. I mean, if the thing that you care about, honestly and sincerely, is carbon dioxide emissions, you would impose a carbon tax, and that would be the mechanism that you would use to try to limit the emissions, while you were actually trying to stimulate a wide range of innovation and entrepreneurship in terms of how the economy would rise to that challenge. If you wanted to eliminate all kinds of distorting, tax exemptions and credits and deductions and this, that, and the other thing in the existing corporate tax code, which is something that we have been begging Congress to do for many years, you would impose a very simple, relatively flat tax with pretty low rates and just use that mechanism to close all of the loopholes. But the structural problem with this is the same thing that Congress always gets into, which is that they cannot resist the temptation to favor various, winners or to disfavor various political losers as part of this process. I mean, one of the mysteries to me about the politics of this specific episode is that, as you pointed out, coal is definitely a target. That is the thing that Senator Manchin keeps saying that he wants to protect. It's very important to West Virginia. So it is kind of mystifying that he is signing up to a bill that is configuring all of these very destructive subsidies, incentives, handouts, tax provisions to try to steer investment away from that industry into all of these other things where we have no idea how well they'll actually work.
And now we're being told by a couple of my sources that the bill actually, if you look at it, includes a $25 billion tax increase on oil and gas production, oil and gas companies. So that will be an additional cost on that fossil fuels. Kim, let's turn to the politics of this. And I want to focus first on Kyrsten Sinema, the senator from Arizona, who has been one of the skeptics about Build Back Better. And she has not declared herself on the Schumer-Manchin bill. Let's listen to Senator Manchin talk about her.
When she looks at the bill and sees the whole spectrum of what we're doing and all of the energy we're bringing and all the reduction of prices and fighting inflation by bringing prices down, by having more energy, hopefully she will be positive about it. But, she'll make her decision, and I respect that.
Well, there's no question Kyrsten Sinema is her own woman. She thinks for herself on a lot of these things. But boy, Kim, I can't see a single senator at this point standing up and stopping this. Maybe she can get some provision or another out, but I doubt she votes against this in the end. What do you think?
Well, they were very clever in how they came up with this, because if you look at the two provisions that really are raising revenue from a tax side, obviously this minimum tax accounts for most of it. And that is one that she has always been a little bit opaque on. She even sort of signaled her willingness at some point to maybe have a minimum tax for corporations. She had obviously put a red line under a number of straight up tax hikes. This is why you saw Joe Manchin all weekend saying, we are not raising taxes here. We're closing a loophole. He was really peddling that because she has said she doesn't want to raise taxes on corporations. So now we're into a game of semantics about this. There is another small provision in the bill on carried interest, which would hit private equity folks. She has expressed her their opposition to that in the past. But I think the calculation on Manchin and Schumer's part is that it doesn't account for much of the revenue in here. Is she really going to be willing to bring down the whole bill based on her stated opposition to that one piece? I tend to agree with you. I don't think she will. She's obviously hearing from some people. She's a senator like that. I have no doubt that she's spending some time talking to some of the corporations back in her state at the moment, hearing from folks. We'll probably get an answer here in the coming days. She may also be waiting for the Senate parliamentarian. She could be hoping that maybe she gets saved from even having to be at the center of this if the Senate parliamentarian were to X out a significant portion of this bill in some way.
Explain why the parliamentarian has such a big role in this.
Yeah, because this is a reconciliation bill, a budget reconciliation bill. And under what are known as the Byrd rules, the bill has to be very straightforwardly focused on budgetary issues of revenue and of spending. And you're not supposed to have a lot of policy provisions thrown in there. And so the Senate parliamentarian takes a look at everything that's being proposed. And if she feels that it is stepping over that line, she has the ability to say, you cannot contain this in the bill because it is obviously a bill that can pass with 51 votes. That's much lower than the filibuster threshold. So there are all these rules that govern it. So Sinema may be hoping that the parliamentarian, for instance, throws out something to do with the prescription drug price controls that are being involved, that are essential to this, or, for instance, something to do with the healthcare provisions, and in such a way upset the carefully crafted bill proportions and therefore blow up the deal. Either way, we'll probably hear from her in coming days, but I'm like you, I'm not very hopeful she's going to stand alone against the tide of this.
Yeah, you mentioned that the drug price control provisions, it's a clear policy change. I mean, I don't know how you can it does have budgetary impacts, of course, but I mean, if you're going to start to force drug companies to negotiate prices with Medicare, that's a policy decision, and that ought to require 60 votes in the Senate. It may be that the parliamentarian goes along with it, but that would save the day for us because I think in many ways, over the long term, this provision, the negotiation, so-called negotiation, it's really a negotiation with a gun to the head of the drug companies because if they don't go along with what Medicare or the Secretary of HHS discovers about what should be the price that Medicare pays, they would have to pay all kinds of financial penalties, not against profits, against sales. So they're going to make an offer to the drug companies can't refuse. And while it only would affect 10 drugs in the initial year, it would grow over time. And you can see that the Congress is going to expand these controls. And that's going to have a hugely damaging effect on drug innovation and investment in the United States, which right now really is the only drug innovation investment that's going on in the rest of the world because of everybody else's price controls. So this is actually really the worst thing in the bill. In my view, it's going to be very hard to remove that once it sets in. Let's talk about another political aspect of this, and that is the state and local tax deduction, which was limited in the Republican tax bill in 2017 to $10,000 per taxpayer. Democrats ran against that in 2018. They've been demanding that it change since. House Democrats laid down the law and said, we're not voting for any tax bill that doesn't do anything about salt. Well, Schumer-Manchin does nothing about salt. Let's listen to Josh Gottheimer, one of those ultimatum House Democrats, talk about this a couple of weeks ago.
Well, I believe we need to fully reinstate it for New Jersey because it's not just about the impact on income levels. It's having a huge impact, salt, as you know, as we've talked about, Becky, on people leaving states like mine and the impact it's having on all earners. And as a result, when people leave, that has a big effect on schools, on hiring law enforcement and firefighters because the tax base drains out when people move to Florida and Texas and the Carolinas like we're seeing in recent years. So it's actually something that hits programs that a lot of people care about that affect low-income families when people leave the state, and the high taxes are causing that.
Well, Joe, I share his analysis about the impact of high taxes in these states and how limiting on the SALT deduction has caused people to want to leave the state. But that's the problem of state tax policy fundamentally. What do you make of the fearless Mr. Gottheimer here? Is he going to scuttle the Pelosi vote on this?
It's really notable that the assumption right now seems to be that this SALT caucus, I think they called themselves in the House, are going to end up rolling over been voting for this bill, even though it doesn't have the kind of fix for the salt issue that they have been banging the drum on for a year and a half. And what's interesting about this is that they will, if they do support the bill, they will do it out of basically this horse race style consideration, this very basic political calculation that it's better for them to be on the team with their fellow Democrats voting for this major bill, and then they can argue about the salt issue again down the road. That is a mistake, I think, on the economic substance of this. Because, look, if they're already worried about individual taxpayers fleeing these high tax jurisdictions because of the salt issue, what happens when you have all of these companies that are employing people in these states that are starting to think about, well, where does it make sense for me to be investing and expanding my business now that I am facing the higher federal tax burden that is imposed by this bill? That makes the high state level tax burdens on some of these businesses even less sustainable than it already is. And so, I think that some of these Democrats from the blue states in the House are going to find themselves in the position where they will vote for this bill. They may or may not ever get the salt relief on the individuals that they're hoping for, at some point in the future. And meanwhile, they will have ended up throwing their support behind a bill that is going to make the situation for business investment and job creation in their state so much worse.
Well, and it may very well cause them to have to make a career change, which is after the election in November, they may not be employable in the United States Congress any longer because they will have lost their election. So maybe they can find other work in the Biden administration if they are looking for it. But I think it's going to cost some of them their careers. Kim, last word to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And overall, if you look at this bill, as the gory details are coming out, it's kind of mesmerizing why any Democrat would be happy to be signing up for a bill that doesn't help inflation, in fact, could hurt it, that is raising taxes across the board, that isn't fulfilling the promises that they had insisted, so they're going to look weak-kneed. This is being presented by the media, as you mentioned, as some sort of big win for the Biden administration. I don't necessarily see it that way going into the midterms.
Well, they're doing their best to try to salvage the congressional majorities, but given the public mood, they may find that extremely difficult to do. But it's nice of the media to volunteer the Democrats, I guess, for career-ending votes. Thanks to Joe, and thanks to Kim. Thanks to all of you for listening. And catch us daily now on Potomac Watch. We're here every day, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.